The Beverly Hills Hilton Ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers as Hollywood's elite settled into their seats for the 48th Annual Golden Globe Awards. January 19, 1991. Al Pacino sat at table 12, wearing a classic black tuxedo, his bow tie perfectly straight, nursing a glass of wine while the pre-ceremony energy buzzed around him. At 51, he'd attended enough award shows to know that anything could happen once the cameras started rolling. The Golden Globes had always been different from the Oscars, more relaxed, more unpredictable, and significantly more dangerous for celebrities who weren't prepared for the unexpected. The Hollywood Foreign Press Association liked to think of their show as more fun, more spontaneous than the Academy's stuffiness, but Al had learned that spontaneity in Hollywood often meant controlled chaos designed for maximum entertainment value. He was nominated for Best Actor in a Motion Picture Drama for his performance in The Godfather Part 3, completing what many considered the greatest trilogy in cinema history. The film had been controversial, with some critics claiming it was unnecessary, that the story had been told perfectly in the first two films. But Al's performance as the aging Michael Corleone, wrestling with guilt and seeking redemption, had earned critical praise and reminded audiences why he was considered one of the finest actors of his generation. The ballroom was filled with the usual suspects, studio heads, agents, publicists, and stars whose presence at such events was more about business than celebration. Al recognized most of the faces at nearby tables, people he'd worked with or competed against for roles over the past 20 years. The atmosphere was convivial but competitive, everyone aware that careers could be made or damaged by a single misstep in front of the cameras. At Al's table sat his longtime agent, his publicist, and several other industry professionals who'd been part of his career for years. The conversation was light, focused on upcoming projects and industry gossip, the kind of shop talk that filled the dead time at every Hollywood gathering. Al participated when spoken to but seemed more interested in observing the room, watching the complex social dynamics that played out at events like this. The show was 20 minutes behind schedule, not unusual for an award ceremony, but long enough for the alcohol to begin affecting inhibitions and for the carefully planned spontaneity to feel more genuinely unpredictable. Al had seen enough award shows derail from minor delays that turned into major disasters when presenters decided to improvise. On stage, the production crew was making final adjustments to the teleprompters and testing microphone levels. The audience could sense the building energy as cameras prepared to go live, transforming a room full of industry professionals into performers in a show watched by millions around the world. The presenter for the Best Actor category had been announced as Danny Morrison, a comedian who'd built his reputation on provocative stand-up routines and late-night talk show appearances. Morrison was 42, sharp-featured with perfectly styled brown hair, wearing a designer tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He was known for his quick wit and his willingness to target celebrities with jokes that often crossed the line from playful to cruel. Al had never met Morrison personally, but he'd seen his stand-up specials and talk show appearances. Morrison's comedy style relied heavily on pop culture references and celebrity roasting, delivered with the kind of smug confidence that suggested he believed his own press about being an edgy truth-teller rather than an opportunistic entertainer feeding off other people's fame. As the show returned from commercial break, Morrison took the stage with the swagger of someone who owned the room. The audience applauded politely, but Al noticed that the applause was more dutiful than enthusiastic. Morrison was popular with younger demographics and television audiences, but his brand of comedy often made industry professionals uncomfortable when they were sitting in the same room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's sound system, "I'm here to present the award for Best Actor in a Motion Picture Drama. And let me tell you, this is a competitive category filled with some truly incredible performances." Morrison paused, scanning the audience with the practiced timing of someone who knew how to milk a moment for maximum effect. Al could see him locating the nominees at their respective tables, preparing for whatever comedic material his writers had prepared. "We have some amazing nominees tonight," Morrison continued, his voice taking on the mock-serious tone that comedians used when setting up punchlines. "Actors who've given everything to their craft, who've pushed the boundaries of what's possible in film performance." Al felt a familiar tightness in his stomach. Something about Morrison's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a straightforward presentation of nominees and winner. And then, Morrison said, his voice shifting to a more playful register, "We have Al Pacino." The mention of his name drew scattered applause from the audience, but Al noticed that Morrison's tone had carried a subtle note of dismissal that made the applause feel more obligatory than celebratory. Morrison let the applause die down before continuing, his expression shifting to something that might have been amusement but looked more like predatory anticipation. "Now, I have to say, Al Pacino is a fascinating choice for this category," Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of false sincerity that preceded cruelty. "Here's an actor who's built his entire career on essentially playing the same character over and over again, just with different costumes." The ballroom went very quiet very quickly. This wasn't gentle ribbing or affectionate roasting. This was a direct attack on Al's professional reputation, delivered in front of his peers and a worldwide television audience. Al felt his jaw tighten, but he maintained his composed expression, knowing that cameras were likely focused on him, waiting for his reaction. Years of experience with hostile critics and difficult interviews had taught him to control his initial responses, to think before reacting. Morrison, sensing he had the room's attention, pressed forward with obvious relish. "I mean, let's be honest here," Morrison continued, his voice gaining confidence from the audience's shocked silence. "Whether he's playing a cop, a gangster, or a blind colonel, it's basically the same performance. Lot of yelling, lot of intensity, lot of," Morrison gestured vaguely, "Al Pacino-ness." Several people at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Industry professionals were accustomed to gentle mockery at award shows, but this felt different. More personal, more deliberately destructive. Morrison wasn't finished. "They say he's a method actor," Morrison said, his voice dripping with mock admiration, "which I guess means he spends months preparing to play Al Pacino. Must be exhausting research, watching yourself in the mirror, practicing yelling HOOAH, until it sounds authentic." The silence in the ballroom was now complete. Even the waiters had stopped moving, sensing that something unprecedented was happening on stage. Al remained motionless at his table, his expression unreadable, but his hands had tightened slightly on his wine glass. But Morrison had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that Al Pacino would sit quietly and absorb the humiliation, that attacking someone's life work in front of their peers would go unanswered. He'd mistaken Al's initial silence for acceptance rather than recognition that a line had been crossed that demanded a response. Morrison continued his assault, his confidence growing with each word. "I mean, come on, people. The Godfather, Serpico, Scarface. It's like watching the same movie with different sets. Same intensity, same shouting, same," Morrison affected an exaggerated Italian-American accent, "Hey, I'm walkin' here." Several industry veterans at nearby tables were now openly uncomfortable, recognizing that Morrison had moved from comedy into territory that was professionally dangerous. But Morrison, intoxicated by what he perceived as audience approval, pressed forward. "And now he's back in The Godfather Part 3, playing Michael Corleone again. I guess when you find something that works," Morrison shrugged theatrically, "why stretch as an actor, right?" That's when Al Pacino stood up. The movement was quiet, controlled, but somehow commanded the attention of everyone in the ballroom. Al rose from his chair with the deliberate grace of someone who'd made a decision, his dark eyes never leaving Morrison's face. The action was so unexpected, so unprecedented in the context of award show protocol, that Morrison actually stopped mid-sentence. "Excuse me," Al said, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom without amplification. The phrase was polite, conversational, but something in his tone made Morrison take an involuntary step backward on the stage. A murmur rippled through the audience as people realized that Al Pacino was about to respond publicly to Morrison's attack. This simply didn't happen at award shows. Nominees being roasted was standard practice, nominees fighting back was uncharted territory. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Al continued, his voice gaining strength and focus, "but I think there's been a misunderstanding. Morrison looked to the production team off stage, perhaps expecting someone to intervene, but the show's producers were frozen by the unprecedented nature of what was happening. This was live television, and Al Pacino was about to deliver an unrehearsed response to an attack on his entire career. "You say I play the same character in every movie," Al said, his voice now carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "That whether I'm a cop or a gangster or a blind colonel, it's basically the same performance." Al began walking toward the stage, his movement purposeful and commanding. The ballroom had gone silent except for the soft sound of his footsteps on the carpet. Every eye in the room was locked on him as he approached the platform where Morrison stood looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Danny," Al said, using Morrison's first name with familiar authority, "may I ask how much research you did before making that assessment of my work?" Morrison's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. This wasn't in his script, wasn't part of his prepared material, and he clearly had no idea how to handle a direct confrontation with one of Hollywood's most respected actors. Al reached the edge of the stage and looked up at Morrison, his presence somehow commanding despite the physical positioning. "Because I'm curious," Al continued, his voice taking on the intensity that had made him famous, "about how someone can watch Michael Corleone's journey from war hero to reluctant don to corrupted tyrant, and see only yelling and intensity." The audience was completely transfixed. This wasn't entertainment anymore, this was an artist defending the core of his life's work in front of the people who mattered most in his profession. "Michael Corleone," Al said, his voice gaining power, "is a man who destroys his soul to protect his family, who becomes everything he once despised in order to preserve what he loves. That's not a performance, Danny. That's a psychological journey that required me to understand how good men become evil through the choices they make." Al's voice was building now, not louder but deeper, more resonant, filling the ballroom with the kind of presence that explained why he'd become one of the most compelling actors of his generation. "And Frank Serpico," Al continued, "wasn't about yelling. Serpico was about portraying a man so committed to honesty that he was willing to die rather than compromise his principles. I spent months with police officers, learning what it costs to be righteous in a corrupt system." Al stepped up onto the stage itself, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there, who had earned the right to share that space through decades of work. "You want to talk about Tony Montana?" Al asked, his voice taking on a new edge. Tony Montana was about understanding the mind of someone so desperate to achieve the American dream that he was willing to destroy everything beautiful about himself to get it. That required me to explore parts of human psychology that most people never have to confront. Morrison stood frozen as Al moved closer, perhaps beginning to understand that he'd attacked not just an actor but an artist who'd spent his career pushing the boundaries of what performance could achieve. "And Frank Slade," Al said, his voice softening but losing none of its power, "required me to spend 4 months learning to live without sight, understanding how blindness changes not just what you see but how you think, how you relate to the world." Al was now standing directly beside Morrison on the stage, and the contrast between them was stark, the comedian who made his living mocking others and the artist who'd spent decades risking everything to find truth in imaginary circumstances. "So when you say these are all the same performance," Al said, looking directly at Morrison, "what you're really saying is that you can't see the difference between a war veteran struggling with family obligation, a cop fighting corruption, a refugee consumed by ambition, and a disabled man seeking meaning in his life." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Al turned from Morrison to face the audience directly, his voice carrying to every person in the room. "And that, ladies and gentlemen," Al said, his voice taking on the kind of quiet authority that made people lean forward to listen, "tells us nothing about my acting and everything about the limitations of how some people choose to see art." Al paused, letting his words settle over the room like a judgment. "Acting isn't about being different in every role. Acting is about being truthful in every role. And if that truth happens to come through with intensity, with passion, with what some people call yelling, then that's what the character demanded." Al looked back at Morrison, who seemed to have shrunk during the exchange. "The question isn't whether Al Pacino plays the same character in every movie," Al said, his voice carrying a finality that suggested he was concluding his thoughts. The question is whether you understand what you're watching when you watch someone disappear completely into another human being's psychology. Al turned back to the audience, his voice rising for the first time, not in anger but in passionate conviction. I've spent 30 years learning how to become other people, how to find the truth of characters that demand everything an actor can give. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, if that seems like too much intensity for critics who prefer their art safe and predictable, then I'll take being misunderstood over being forgettable. Al looked around the ballroom, his eyes taking in hundreds of faces that were watching him with a mixture of awe and respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. Because great acting isn't about making audiences comfortable, Al said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who'd proven his point beyond any doubt. Great acting is about making audiences feel something real, something truthful, something that stays with them long after they leave the theater. Al stepped back from the microphone, his presentation complete, his point made with devastating clarity. The silence that followed lasted nearly 15 seconds, an eternity in television time. Then someone in the back of the ballroom began to applaud. Slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Within seconds, the entire room was on their feet, delivering a standing ovation that lasted nearly 3 minutes. Al returned to his table with quiet dignity, accepting congratulations from industry colleagues who'd witnessed something unprecedented. Morrison, left alone on stage, attempted to continue with the award presentation, but his remaining jokes fell flat, his confidence shattered by the demonstration of what real star power looked like. When Al won the Golden Globe that night, his acceptance speech was brief and gracious, making no reference to the earlier exchange. But everyone in the room understood that something significant had happened. An artist had defended not just his own work but the entire concept of passionate, committed performance. The video of Al's response was replayed on entertainment news programs for weeks. Industry professionals who'd witnessed it firsthand called it the most powerful defense of method acting they'd ever seen. Acting schools requested copies to show students as an example of artistic integrity in action. Danny Morrison's career never fully recovered from the exchange. He continued working, but his reputation as someone who could handle high-profile events was permanently damaged. In interviews years later, he would admit that he'd learned an important lesson about the difference between comedy and cruelty. Al never spoke publicly about the incident again, but his subsequent career choices suggested that Morrison's attack had clarified something important about his relationship with critics who didn't understand what he was trying to achieve as an artist. The Golden Globe ceremony became legendary not for who won awards that night, but for the moment when one of America's greatest actors proved that sometimes the most powerful response to mockery is simply telling the truth about what your work really means.